You're listening to the Wired for Impact podcast.
I mean, the average person who would be an advocate for, who still thinks that the current education system is producing intelligent kids. I mean, some kids are graduating with a lot of education, 4.0s and stuff like that. What do you mean that they don't know anything? Give us a little perspective on what you mean by that.
The teachers can't deviate from the norm or deviate from the textbook because they're subservient to one, the political environment within the schools, which are the certain things that you can't teach, you can't say. And two, they're subservient to the paperwork, which is the standardized testing. So they have to teach to those tests. And if the students get good grades on those tests, that's great because that leads to things like people getting promotions, to the funding coming in, to everything that goes along with that. Whereas if they don't do good on those tests, right, there are repercussions from that sense, right? I mean, everything from even to where the teachers are being observed in this one class a semester. And if that observation isn't up to par with what the bureaucracy wants, then that teacher gets into trouble. So everything's just very machine-like, very rote. This is what we're teaching. This is how you do it. And, if you try to deviate from that at all, originality, really prompting the kids to think about the world, then you get smacked on the wrist. Your institution, the school, gets smacked on the wrist. And, one person after another is held accountable for that. And because of that, everyone really, it's like the principal is a prisoner, right? And then the assistant principal is a prisoner to the principal. And the teachers are prisoners to that. And it's like the prisoners run the asylum because you'll find a lot of very good teachers. I mean, I've met many very good, real historians, people who very much are against what's going on in the mainstream, but they feel like when they're in that system, they can't have those conversations with the children. And it's really unfortunate because, they're really wasting a lot of good people and a lot of good talent that are out there.
Yeah, I agree. It's one thing that I've always said about the schooling that my kids have received, and is that it's filled with good people. There's a lot of really good people there with good hearts, and a lot of them are great educators in a lot of sense. But you noted a minute ago that it's almost like it's a ship with no captain. But at the same time, I would almost argue that there is a captain. It's just maybe not the captain's not in the ship. It's like everything is standards based, which begs the question: well, who's creating the standards? Who is the captain? Who is creating the railways that everybody has to stay within? Do you know who those standards are? Like, where are those standards coming from? Do you know?
It's almost fractal. I mean, in one sense, yes, I know where they're coming from. In that, for example, if you study the history of education, you would get back to something called the Reese Committee in the 1950s. It was a congressional committee. And they were investigating tax-exempt foundations to see if they were involved in what they called un-American activities. And they defined, it's important, like this is a classical education term, right? It's important that we define terms. Well, they defined un-American activities as any means by these tax-exempt foundations of altering the democratic process of the United States of America in a way that wasn't outlined in the Constitution, that it wasn't meant to be that way, right? Subversive means. And anyway, this guy, Norman Dodd, really great guy, lifelong whistleblower. He took on the banks before he did this. Actually took on the banks, which is nice. But Dodd got access to the corporate minutes of the Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. And what he found is dating back to, he found a lot of things, like dating back to 1910, they were already scheming to get America into what would be World War I, like really nefarious stuff from these tax-exempt foundations, because they're controlled by the bankers, and the bankers had vested interest in that. It's all a conglomerate of mush. But after World War I, these foundations really wanted to make sure, at the time, the agenda changes, but the methods are the same. At the time, they wanted to make sure that America never got back to an anti-war mindset. And of course, now we live in the great empire, right? It's shameful when you really understand what our country does, how they invade other countries in the Middle East. And what happens, the human cost of that? Like these children that have lived their entire lives with American fighter jets dropping bombs over their head because of lies, right? To spread democracy, right? Well, they never wanted America to get back to an anti-war mindset. And they determined that the best way they could prevent that from happening was to take over Americans' understanding of history, which is very interesting. It leads me to where I am, the historian, right? So Americans' understanding of history. And at first, they tried to do that by bribing the leading historical authorities, individuals of the day, and they were turned down uniformly. They offered money, turned down. Great, no problem. They set their sights on the university system, and they handpicked 20 students from around the country, and they flew them across the ocean to London. And like the devil, luring Jesus out to the desert and offering him the world, they offered these 20 students the world. But, you know, they weren't Jesus. So they wind up getting $400,000 in grants, which was a tremendous amount of money at the time. We're talking about 1930s, right? And 10 years later, they make up the governing board of the American Historical Association, which at the time, the American Historical Association was in charge of best practices as it relates to the way future history teachers will be trained and best practices as to what goes into history textbooks. And just like that, they took over the way history was taught, the people teaching it and their understanding what's in the textbook, the way it's taught in the United States of America. Now, the agenda changes, but the methods are generally the same. In fact, they did the same thing with the medical system. I could get into that after if you want. But this started with me saying that it's like the ship is driving, but there's no one there, right? There's a boat moving, but there's no one at the helm. There's no captain. Well, what I mean by that is, yeah, you have these bureaucrats at the Department of Education, and you would say, well, the Department of Education is determining, you know, where the funding's going and what these schools are teaching. So the Department of Education is at the helm. But these people at the Department of Education are put into place. These are political hacks. They're bureaucrats who are put into place. They're appointed by the worst hacks of all, the politicians. And through their vetting, they have to go through the vetting, and basically it has to make sure that they're politically correct. So people will look at the schools now and say, oh my God, how could it be possible that they're teaching children very inappropriate messaging? They're teaching children that are in second grade about LGBTQ, QRS, TUV, WX, YZ, when meanwhile, you shouldn't be talking to my children about anything sexual. All right, you're there to educate them. They should be learning reading, writing, arithmetic, carpentry, engineering, right? They shouldn't be talking about sodomy, okay? It's inappropriate. Everyone knows it's inappropriate. They bully people. They make people feel like they can't say the obvious truth or there'll be repercussions. Well, those repercussions that everyone feels, those bureaucrats, those politically correct hacks, these are the type of people that are most controlled by that outward pressure. So you have this outward societal pressure pushed by institutions, pushed by the outrage mob, and say, oh my God, you're so hateful. How don't you want to teach LGBTQRSTUV to second graders? And then it gets into the curriculum. So yeah, the Department of Education is driving the wheel, but these people they're like autonomous drones. They're NPCs. They're just controlled by the whims of what they're supposed to think. And that's how the system really functions. And the more people see that, that's why I tell them it's really broken from the base level. So yes, it's important that we get into PTA meetings and we try to fix the system. We run for school board presidents. Yes, do that big time. But ultimately what we need to do is say, while that's going on, we can build a parallel system. Like they can do their thing in the public school. I'm not trying to, go do your thing, but we'll build a parallel system and do our thing. And then we'll see what people like more. And I think barring interference, which of course that's always potentially something that could happen, I think it's clear what people will like more.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Wired for Impact. If you're interested in creating and expanding your impact, be sure to visit us online at impactnow.com.